بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Last week we finished the Tafseer of Surah Al-Layl, and we basically talked at the end about the overall theme of the Surah Al-Layl, and we said that the Surah basically talks about the nobility and the virtues of the actions of the believers, and also the evilness and the uh, the the evilness and the lowliness of the actions of the disbelievers, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent a messenger to remind them of the truth and warn those who disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and reminding them of an affliction and a punishment which they will face. So that was basically the overview of that surah after we finished. And today, inshallah, we're going to be going over and starting of Surah Al-Shams, which is the surah before Surah Al-Layl, the 93rd surah of the Quran. It's a Makki surah. The surah itself has 15 ayahs altogether, and in the Makki Mus'haf it has 16 ayahs. So in another style of writing, it has 16 ayahs, but in the one that we all are familiar with, it has 15 ayahs. And this surah, its theme, its general theme, is after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes numerous oaths in this surah, He discusses and He mentions the success of those who purify their souls. And He mentions the failure of those who corrupt their souls. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives an example in this surah, in Surah Al-Shams, of those who had their souls corrupted with shirk, by mentioning the story of the people of Thamud. كَذَّبَتْ ثَمُودُ بِطَغْوَاهَا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions their test and the fact that they failed, and the fact that they committed sins and disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the punishment of the people of Thamud as a result. And with regards to this surah and the arrangement of this surah in the Quran, it comes after Surah Al-Balad, لا أقسم بهذا البلد, and before Surah, it comes after Surah Al-Balad and before Surah Al-Layl. And we'll mention some of the reasons why it's arranged in this specific order. And with regards to the surahs of the Quran, an interesting thing to note is the word surah itself. The word surah itself, the scholars, they say that the literal meaning of the word means an enclosure or a fencing, or for example a wall which surrounds a city. So this is the meaning that some of the scholars give with regards to the word sur itself. And also they say that the meaning of surah or sur is something, or a plain, a land which is elevated, an elevated plain. And so the scholars, they say, with regards to the surahs of the Quran and how these meanings are connected to the surahs that we talk about when we talk about surahs in the Quran, they say that first of all, with regards to it being a fencing and an enclosure, because every single surah is separate from the surah which comes before and the surah that comes after. It has its borders, if you like. It has its own wall and parameters and fencing, in the sense that you have the basmala at the beginning, and then once the surah finishes, you have the basmala for the next surah. And also with regards to its meaning, the theme and the subject matter, the content of that surah differs from surah to surah. So in this sense, it's surrounded and is protected, this fencing or this wall, which signifies, and it basically shows that this surah is one specific surah with its specific ayat. And also they say that the word surah, when referred to in the Quran, they say that when a person recites a surah from the Quran, it's like as if they're being elevated. When a person recites a surah from the surahs of the Quran, status is being elevated, they're increasing in status, they're increasing in reward because of the surah and the ayat that they're reciting. And the Messenger of Allah, he mentioned in the hadith where he said, on the day of judgment, the person will be asked, it will be said to him, recite and rise. And then for each ayah that he recites, and for each ayah that he had memorized, as a result of that, he will be raised in status in paradise. So you see this connection, this beautiful connection between the meaning, the literal meaning of the word surah, and also the Islamic meaning of the word. And also with regards to the arrangements of the surahs, because we discuss how the surahs are connected to the surahs which come after and the surahs which come before the surahs that we discuss and the tafsir that we give for the surahs that we talk about. And with regards to the arrangements of the surahs, the scholars, they say that the arrangement of the surah, meaning how was it done? Was it something which was divinely ordained from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Or was it something which the companions had ijtihad over? Meaning they made the decisions after discussing it and after contemplating and thinking about the surahs and its content and its themes, and then they placed them in the orders that we have now. And they differed with regards to this, and some of them, they said that the arrangements were purely from the ijtihad of the companions, radiallahu anhum ajma'in. And others, they said that the arrangements or the arrangement of the surahs in the Quran was done partly by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and partly by the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So some of the surahs were arranged because of revelation, because the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say, this surah goes here and this surah goes here. And some of them was by the ijtihad and the decision that was made by the companions because of the knowledge that they had. The third opinion is that the surahs were arranged purely because of revelation. It was divinely inspired to the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wassalam. And they say that this opinion is an opinion which is the strongest opinion according to most of the scholars. And there's texts and of this opinion, because the Messenger of Allah sometimes he would mention surahs of the Quran, and he would mention them in a specific order when he would talk about them with regards to their virtues, for example. So he would say, for example, with regards to Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Imran, he would say, recite the two bright ones, Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran. And so you have them coming in that order in the Quran. And also, for example, when the Messenger of Allah talks about the virtues of the last three surahs of the Quran, he mentions قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. And he mentions them in this order. And other surahs as well. He mentions the virtues of them, and this is the order of how they are arranged in the Quran. Also, in the acts of the Messenger of Allah with regards to reciting the Quran. So he would recite the Quran, and the way he would recite the Quran is he would recite it how it was arranged in the Quran that we have today. And this is why, when one of the companions was praying with the Messenger of Allah, he recited Surah Baqarah, and then Ali Imran, and then Surah An-Nisa in the same rak'ah. And so he recited them in that specific order, arranged in this specific way or in this specific place in the Quran. And first, the first thing with regards to this arrangement and this, why this surah is placed in this area, is because of some of the similarities between some of the ayat which are mentioned in Surah Al-Shams and those which are mentioned in Surah Al-Layl. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, in this surah, in Surah Al-Shams, Allah says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, which we'll discuss today. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا. And in Surah Al-Layl, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى. So you have these similarities between some of the ayat of these two specific surahs. Also, in Surah Al-Layl, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالنَّهَارِ وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا. Okay, in Surah Al-Layl, Allah says, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا. And in this surah, in Surah Al-Shams, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا. So you have certain similarities with regards to the rhythm and the style of recitation. Also in Surah Al-Shams, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the individuals whose souls or whose souls will be victorious. The nafs purified and how their souls will be successful. Yet in Surah Al-Layl, the surah which comes after Surah Al-Shams, Allah mentions, He goes into detail. And this is what we talked about last week and the weeks before that. فَأَمَّا مَنْ أَعْطَى وَاتَّقَى وَصَدَّقَ بِالْحُسْنَى. So Allah goes into more detail with regards to those who are successful and those who purify their souls. So that's with regards to the arrangement of the surah and how it's connected to the surahs surrounding it. And also, it's connected to Surah Al-Duha, which is 2 surahs down. Because in this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an oath. He's making an oath in the beginning of this surah. And this is similar to some of the surahs which we mentioned before, and also some of the surahs which come later. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا in the Quran. Also the surah before this, لَا أُقْسِمُ بِهَذَا الْبَلَدِ. Again, it's an oath. Allah is making an oath. So all of these surahs, they're all connected because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these surahs, He's making oaths. At the beginning of the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is swearing by specific things. And in this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts again by making an oath. And He says, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, by the sun and its radiance. And in this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes oaths in the first 7 ayat. So the first 7 ayat of this surah is just oaths. Allah is basically making oaths. Subhanahu wa ta'ala gives in this surah, He says, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, by the sun and its radiance. And the sun is mentioned here because it's one of the greatest signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sheikh Uthaymeen rahimahullah, he talks about the sun in his tafsir, and talks about the benefits of the sun, how it gives warmth, how it gives light. And also people benefit from it in terms of even electricity today, solar panels. In of itself, it gives a person health. When a person is lacking from sunlight, he suffers. He has certain conditions and certain illnesses and certain ailments because of a lack of sunlight. And so we see these different types of benefits that a person has simply from being exposed to the sun. A person's mood in of itself can change. Especially here, when it's sunlight, like vitamin D, exactly, vitamin D. When a person is exposed to sunlight, he gets a lot of vitamin D. Okay, here we don't get that much vitamin D because of a lack of sunlight. Okay, also, for example, doesn't have a lot of energy, but when the sun comes out, he's full of life. He's happy. So subhanAllah, it even changes an individual's mood and it changes how he feels about things. So you see all of these benefits of the sun in of itself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, He's swearing by the sun. وَالشَّمْسِ. He says, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا. He says by the sun and its radiance, meaning the radiance of the sun, the glow of the sun, the brightness and the glow and the radiance of the sun. And Qatada rahimahullah, the famous tabi'i, he said that the word duhaha here isn't just referring to the radiance of the sun, but it's referring to the whole of the day. So it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying by the sun and what the radiance that it gives to the rest of the day, meaning the light that it emits for the whole of the day so long as the sun is out. And also the scholars, they mentioned that duha is a type of radiance, a type of glow which doesn't cause any discomfort, doesn't cause any pain. Sometimes when the sun is very hot, okay, maybe not here, but in other countries, when it's very hot, a person, he can't stay out in the sun too long. It burns his skin, a person can get skin cancer, he has to put cream on and things like this. So it ends up causing some pain and some difficulty for that person. He has to find shade. Yet here the word duha, it's referring to rays or glow, or a glow or radiance which doesn't cause any type of burning or any type of pain or discomfort. And also they say duha is something which is specific for the sun. You can't describe anything else that emits light by mentioning the word duha. So a lamp, for example, a candle, a bulb, a light bulb, a headlight on a car, even the moon or the stars. You can't mention the word duha to describe those things. This is something which is specific to the sun itself. And also it's something which doesn't cause any burns or discomfort or pain. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in Surah Taha, He says, إِنَّ لَكَ أَلَّا تَجُوعَ فِيهَا وَلَا تَعْرَى. That in it, in paradise, you will never go hungry and nor will you be naked. وَأَنَّكَ لَا تَظْمَأُ فِيهَا وَلَا tadha, that nor will you be thirsty in it, wala tadha. The same word is used, that you won't swelter, meaning that there'll be light in paradise. But that light and that nur, that duha that you will have, it won't cause a person to start feeling discomfort, to start sweltering, and to start feeling, pain and start sweating. So it's a type of comfort. It's going to be radiant. It's going to be soothing. It's going to be a soothing type of light. So likewise here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing the sun after he's making an oath by the sun itself, subhanAllah. So he's making an oath, and then he's reminding us of the beauty of the sun itself. After he's made an oath by it, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, by the sun and its radiance, reminding us that the sun isn't just, like anything else, but it's something which gives peace to the heart. It's something which is radiant. It's something which brings about comfort. When it's at the right temperature, it brings about a type of soothing and a type of comfort to the heart, which maybe other things don't. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the first ayah, he's making an oath by the sun itself, and then mentioning one of the reasons why it's such a great sign and some of its beauty. وَضُحَاهَا وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the second ayah, he says, وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا, and the moon as it follows it. And the moon as it follows it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after swearing by the sun, in the second ayah now, he's swearing by the moon. وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. And the word tala is used to mean when you follow something. And this is why when we recite, we say tilawa. Tilawa comes from the same root word as talaha. Tala is the root word. And the reason why tilawa is called tilawa is because when you read, you're following the words in the mushaf. You're following the words in the Quran and in the surah that you're reciting. So you're following. So likewise here, when a person observes and when he notices the sun in the sky during the day, and as the day goes by, the sun starts to set, what starts happening? As the sun is setting, the moon is coming up. So it's in its own orbit, And so as the sun is going down, sometimes it's not even dark. It's not even Maghrib time. And you can see the moon up in the air. So the sun is going down and you can see the moon following it. وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. And the moon as it follows the sun. So subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is giving another example of one of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also the miracle of the moon itself. How it's following the sun. Every single day the sun goes down and the moon comes up. It's following the sun. And the sun goes up again the next day and the moon goes down. And then as the sun sets again, it comes up again. So it's as if it's following the sun itself. And also some of the scholars, they say that talaha here means when something replaces something else. The word tala can mean when something replaces something else. So it's as if it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the sun is setting and what's taking its place is the moon. And also the fact that the moon is taking the sun's place, and at the same time it's also providing some sort of light. So it's replacing the sun in two ways. First of all, with regards to its position. So the sun was in the sky at night, the moon is now in the sky. And also with regards to its benefit. The sun gives light. You have sunlight. But then at the same time, the moon also has light. It has moonlight. So at night, you have the glow of the moon. So this is another way in which the moon, the qamar, follows the sun. Not only physically with regards to it following it in the sky, and when the sun sets, the moon comes up, but also with regards to its benefit, the light in and of itself. The light is coming down, and this is why, subhanAllah, on a clear night, when the moon is out, in the middle of the Islamic months, the 13th, 14th, 15th, which are known as Ayyamul Bid, the white days, and this is why they're called white days, because the moon is a full moon. Ayyamul Bid is known as the full days because the moon in those days is completely full. It's a full moon. And so when you see the moon on those nights and the moon is full, and there's no clouds in the sky and you don't have street lights, you can see that the moon is actually giving off light. And people notice this more when you're in villages. Those who live in villages, those who don't have street lights where they live, they notice this more. When we live in the cities, we don't notice the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as much. And another meaning which is mentioned with regards to this ayah, وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا, and the moon as it follows it, they say that it's following the sun in the sense that it's taking its light. It's taking its light and it's reflecting the light. Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, he mentions in his Tafseer, he says, تَلَاهَا أُخِذَ مِنْهَا or أَخَذَ مِنْهَا. يعني it takes from the sun. And al-qamar يَأْخُذُ مِنْ ضَوْءِ الشَّمْسِ, that the moon takes from the light of the sun. So this is another meaning which is mentioned by the scholars with regards to the tafsir and the meaning of this ayah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also in another ayah, he mentions تَبَارَكَ الَّذِي جَعَلَ فِي السَّمَاءِ بُرُوجًا وَجَعَلَ فِيهَا سِرَاجًا وَقَمَرًا مُنِيرًا. Allah Azza wa Jal, he says, blessed is he who placed constellations in the sky and placed in it a lamp, وَقَمَرًا مُنِيرًا, and an illuminating moon. And the word munir is used when you take light from something and you give that light off. So subhanAllah, in the Quran itself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us one of the signs, one of the miracles which, humankind only discovered maybe 100 or 200 years ago, which is the fact that the moon itself actually deflects and reflects light. It's deflecting light from the sun. The sun itself is the one that's giving off the light, okay? And the moon is collecting this light and deflecting it and reflecting it onto earth itself. And this is something, subhanAllah, which modern science has proven, and it's from the miracles of the Quran in and of itself. Another opinion with regards to, these opinions which we've mentioned, with regards to this specific ayah, someone may say, which one is correct? Which one is a correct opinion? Because there's numerous opinions. One of the principles of tafsir is that if there's multiple opinions with regards to one ayah and they don't conflict, then they are all accepted. You can accept all of them. And this doesn't cause any issues, but in fact it's the opposite. It shows the eloquence and the beauty and the brilliance of the Quran. The fact that you have these multiple meanings. It's like, for example, in English when we use a word and the word has double meanings. We don't say there's a problem with the English language then. We don't say there's something wrong with the English language because how can a word mean two things or three things? It's actually the opposite. It gives richness to the language itself. So likewise with the Quran, when an ayah is given multiple explanations and multiple tafsir, as long as they don't contradict, then we accept all of these different meanings. So this shows you the eloquence and the beauty and raises the status, okay, and the beauty of the Quran in and of itself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the second ayah, he says, وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا, and the moon as it follows it, meaning as it follows the sun, with regards to replacing it in the sky, with regards to giving benefit to the people during the night by its light, with regards to replacing the beauty of the sun. When the sun sets, you have the beauty of the moon at night time. So it's replacing the sun in all of these things. And then in the third ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, and the day as it reveals it. And the day as it reveals it. In Surah Al-Layl, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a similar ayah. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى. So what's the difference between the two? In Surah Al-Layl, when Allah says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى, and the day as it reveals. So it's not mentioning what it's revealing. In Surah Al-Layl, Allah doesn't mention what it's revealing. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى, and the day as it reveals. Yet here in this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning what the day is revealing. And the day as it reveals it. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا. It's referring back to something. Now what is it referring back to? The scholars, they said, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, and the day as it reveals it, they say that is revealing the sun and the magnificence and the beauty of the sun and the greatness of the sun. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, meaning when the day comes, you see the beauty of the day. And it's only because of the sun that you see the beauty of the day. The creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only seen when the sun rises, especially in the morning, subhanAllah, as the sun is rising. You see the beauty of the sunlight, and as the earth and as the land starts to become, starts to illuminate because of the light of the sun, that's when you see the beauty of the land itself. So they say that the ha here, the dhamir, jallaha, as it reveals it, is referring to the sun itself. Other scholars, they said it's referring to the earth itself, whatever is on the face of the earth. So the sun is revealing whatever is on the face of the earth. So you have these two meanings. One of them referring to the sun, that as it reveals it, as it reveals the sun itself, and the other as it reveals whatever is on the face of the earth from the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you see all of these oaths, and all of them mentioning some of the ayat and some of the signs and some of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, and the day as it reveals it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the fourth ayah, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, and the night as it conceals it. And the night as it conceals. So subhanAllah, you see, you have the Shams at the beginning, and then you have the moon, the sun and the moon, and then you have the day and the night. So the sun is mentioned first, and then in the third ayah, the day is mentioned. In the second ayah, the moon is mentioned, and in this ayah now, the night is being mentioned. So you have this pattern, And sometimes when people talk about how the Messenger of Allah wasn't a messenger, okay, and how he made these things up, okay, he was a poet or something like this, he was eloquent, then to be able to construct words like this and sentences like this, remembering, what you said 2 or 3 ayat before, this is something which is very hard to do, especially when you can't read and write. If you can read and write these things, maybe you can start comparing and looking at, how this ayah matches with this ayah and how this ayah matches with that ayah. But when a person doesn't read or write, and he has to say these things, and the first time he says them, as soon as he says them, they're perfect. And when I speak in this talk, I always make mistakes. I'm always stuttering. I'm always going back and forth. Okay, I don't speak perfectly. Even though I prepare these things. And likewise with us, any of us, when we have conversations with one another, we're not going to say exactly, we're not going to speak exactly perfectly, exactly how we want things to sound, how we want things to come across. Yet with the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when it was revealed to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu, every time he would recite the Quran, he would recite it perfectly, without any mistakes, without any errors. And subhanAllah, this should show an individual the miracle of the Quran itself, the fact that it must have been divinely revealed. Thousands and thousands of ayat, 6,236 ayat in the Quran. Every single ayah, they were recited with complete perfection. No mistakes, no errors. It never had to be revised. It never had to be checked and edited. It was never written down initially. It was all verbal. The first time he would recite it, the companions would hear and they would record it. SubhanAllah, they would start writing it down. So this shows you the miracle of the Quran itself. The fact that it must be the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nobody when they speaks perfectly. Forever, And even then when a person speaks and he comes up with beautiful statements, sometimes, one of us may say something, okay, and we're impressed with what we say. We come up with some good slogan or some good catchphrase, or some good poem or some good rhyme, okay. Now when we come up with something like this, we want to be recognized for what we've said. We don't want anybody else to take the credit for what we've said. Because it's us who've said it. Now if somebody takes our statements and says, so-and-so said it, somebody else said it. A person writes an article, for example. A person writes a book. And somebody else claims, the fact that they're the ones, takes the credit. He claims that he was the one who wrote that book. A person would be upset, you'd be upset. Because they never wrote that book. They never made that rhyme, that poem. They never wrote that song, for example. But here with the Quran, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu himself, even though it's words and ayat and phrases, the beauty and eloquence of which he never claims for himself. Not once does he ever say it's from me. He always says this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَا هُوَ بِقَوْلِ شَاعِرٍ. the Messenger of Allah when he's being given revelation, he says, this is not the words of a poet. I'm not a poet. Whereas you see how the people were shocked and amazed with the Quran at that time. Yet nobody criticized the Messenger of Allah for not claiming those words to be his own. If anybody was to claim that they were his own words, it would be the Messenger of Allah himself. Why wouldn't you want to claim that these words and these ayat are your own phrases? You are the one who made these words. So this in and of itself is another evidence to show that the Quran in and of itself wasn't the speech of man, wasn't the speech of a human being, but it was the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. And so here, in the fourth ayah, Allah is going back 2 ayahs. Allah mentions the qamar, وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. And then He mentions the day in the 3rd ayah. In the 4th ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the night, related to the 2nd ayah, which refers to the moon. Allah says, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا. And the night as it conceals it. And also this ayah, a similar ayah is mentioned in Surah Al-Layl, which we discussed the last few weeks, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى. The first ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, by the night and what it covers. By the night and what it conceals. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا. So it's mentioning specifically what it's concealing. In Surah Al-Layl, Allah doesn't mention what it's concealing, what it's covering. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning what it's concealing, what it's covering. And the dhamir, or the ha at the end, the it at the end, as it conceals it, is referring to the sun itself. So, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, the night as it covers, as it conceals the sun. Meaning the sun isn't there anymore. There's darkness which has overcome everything. Darkness which has overcome the land. The sun in and of itself has basically gone. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in this ayah, and in the previous ayahs, we see a common theme. We see a common theme with the fact that the ending of these ayat, they're all referring back. وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا. So it's all referring back. And it's all referring back to one thing. These oaths are all referring back to the sun. And this shows you the status and the greatness of this creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the sun itself. Previous ayat, previous surahs, they don't go back to that specific oath at the beginning. وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ وَطُورِ سِنِينَ. It goes on, it mentions different things, different creations in this world of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى. It's not referencing something else. It's not referencing the first ayah. وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى. Even in Surah Al-Layl, Allah doesn't go back. Yet in this surah, Allah is always going back to the sun. He's always referring to the sun. And this shows you the greatness of the sun itself, this miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This miracle that scientists say if it moved 1 millimeter, it would cause the whole of the earth to be destroyed. If it would move just a short amount, 1 millimeter or 1 centimeter, it would basically destroy the earth. That's how perfectly, orbit the sun is placed in this galaxy of ours. So, these ayat, when they refer back to the sun, it's showing the greatness of the sun itself, because it's always going back to the sun. وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا. The duhaha, the light, it's referring to the sun. Even the first ayah itself, Allah mentions the sun, by the sun, I swear by the sun. And the light, its light, the light of the sun. So the light is going back to the sun itself. وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. And the moon as it follows it. Meaning the moon is following the sun in terms of its position, in terms of its greatness, in terms of its benefit, all of these things, in terms of the light that it gives off is deflecting from the sun onto the earth. So the moon is being referred back to the sun itself. وَالنَّهَارِ. The night, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا. The night is the day is referring back to the sun itself. The day itself is referring back. Jallaha. Jallaha, we mentioned this last week, the root word comes from the same word as Jalal. which means the greatness of something. And this is why one of the names of Allah is Al-Jalal. The greatness, we're talking about the greatness of the sun itself. So that the Nahar, the day, is also being referred back to the sun. So all of this showing the greatness of the sun itself. And now the night, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, the night covering the sun, the night covering the Shams. All of these things show the greatness of the sun and the miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And sometimes, when we're around the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't tend to notice these things. We travel, we wake up, the sun comes through our windows and we're asleep, and it sometimes hurts our eyes. Sometimes we're driving and the sun gets in our way and we put the visors down in our cars. We don't think about the beauty and the miracle of the sun itself. SubhanAllah, sometimes you travel and you drive and the sun is setting, or the sun is rising. And you can't help but admire the beauty of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is generally with the creation of Allah, with nature itself. When you see these things, when you see the sun, when you see the moon, when you see the stars, when you see animals, you see these things and it amazes you. You think, subhanAllah, how can anyone deny the creation, this creation, without understanding that there must have been a creator to this creation? When you deny a creator, it's as if you're denying the creation itself, because everything must have come from somewhere. Someone must have made everything that you see in front of you. And so subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates all of these different creations for us, the stars and different types of stars, the sun and the moon, these different types of animals, these different colors that we are surrounded by. And you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there was no need for him to do this. We think about all the different types of animals. There was no need for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make all of these different types of animals. Yet he did this to show his greatness, to prove that there is a creator, to amaze us with how powerful and how great he is as a sculptor, as an inventor, as a creator, as an artist. There's no greater artist than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see nature in the morning and in the evening, and the nature around you, and you're amazed by it, the colors and the vibrancy. And so subhanAllah, sometimes we tend to forget about the simple things which show the miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and from them the sun itself. When the sun rises and we see the rest of the land and everything on the face of this earth, because of the sun itself, we're able to work, we're able to do things because of the sun. So all of these things, they show you the miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes oaths on other things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, and then he says, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَمَا بَنَاهَا, and the sky, and he who built it. And then he mentions the earth. And then he mentions the soul. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا. So he mentions these other creations of Allah. And inshallah next week, we'll talk about these other signs, and also we'll talk about the connection between the sun and the soul. Why is the soul mentioned? وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا. What does the sun specifically have to do with the soul? Because we mentioned every single surah is connected. Every single ayah is connected to the ayah before it and after it. So we'll talk about what the connection is between the sun itself and the nafs, and how these two things are related to one another, and why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it in this specific surah. So inshallah we'll conclude here, and next week we'll continue with the tafsir of this surah. If there's any questions, then I'll do my best to answer them inshallah. Is there a principle to tell what the pronouns are referring to? Sometimes you can tell by the ayah itself. So sometimes the way the ayah is structured, the thing that is describing, goes back to the ayah. For example, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا. So that by the sun and its light. So it's talking about the sun, because that's what was mentioned before the pronoun itself, the dhamir itself. And sometimes it's not as clear. And this is why the scholars they mention what it can be referred to. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.